Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. In this introduction to motor systems, I'm going to be talking about the motor unit and lower motor neurons. Abbreviations in this portion of our lecture are LMN, lower motor neuron, MN, motor neuron, ACH, acetylcholine, CNS, central nervous system, and PNS, peripheral nervous system. This portion of our lecture will also include a chemical symbol, Ca2+ for calcium, and a Greek letter, alpha. Voluntary motor neurons that are innervating the skeletal muscles of our neck, trunk, and limbs have their somas situated in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. A motor unit is a single voluntary motor neuron, and all of the muscle cells it innervates. So a muscle will have several motor neurons going to it to innervate it. But each motor neuron is going to innervate a unique set of muscle cells within that muscle. And that is the motor unit. The number of muscle cells within any given motor unit is highly variable and dependent upon the muscle. Muscles that are involved with very fine control, such as the small muscles on our eye that move the eyeball around in the socket, or the intrinsic muscles of your hand, important for that fine control of your fingers and thumb. They will have very small motor units. Each motor neuron may innervate only 6 to 10 muscle cells. However, muscles that are involved in more power activities or posture, such as the erector spinae muscles or the quadriceps femoris muscle, will have much larger motor units. Here, a single voluntary motor neuron might innervate as many as 1,000 muscle cells. Here's a picture of what a motor unit looks like. So we have a single voluntary motor neuron. Its cell body is located in the ventral horn, and you can see that when it gets to the muscle, it's innervating, in this case, 4 muscle fibers. Together, that single motor neuron and those 4 muscle fibers make up the motor unit. A lower motor neuron is that voluntary motor neuron that is going into the periphery and directly innervating muscle. Regardless of whether this neuron is located in a cranial nerve or located in a spinal nerve, the lower motor neuron will have its soma within the CNS. If it is a cranial nerve, that soma will be located in a nucleus within the brainstem. If it is a spinal nerve, that soma will be in the ventral horn. The axon of the neuron will be within the peripheral nervous system. For those that are going to innervate muscles of our neck, trunk, or limbs, the axon will travel out of the spinal cord in the ventral root, then enter the spinal nerve, and then enter either the dorsal or ventral ramus. And if it is going to one of the limbs, it will then enter a plexus, either the brachial plexus or the lumbosacral plexus. From there, it will enter into one of the peripheral nerves, one of the branches of the plexus, and that will take it to its target muscle. You will recall from our discussion of muscle spindles that we have intrafusal fibers and extrafusal fibers. Those 6 to 12 fibers within the muscle spindle are the intrafusal fibers. Those are the fibers that have the annulospiral ending wrapped around the center and flower spray endings just either side of that. The extrafusal fibers are the regular skeletal muscle cells, in which the muscle spindles are embedded in between. Just like sensory neurons come in various types, we have 1A and 2s and A betas and A deltas, etc. We have more than one type of motor neuron. The lower motor neuron that innervates the skeletal muscle cells, that is the extrafusal fibers, is known as an alpha motor neuron. Alpha motor neurons are multipolar neurons. So they're going to have a soma with a whole bunch of dendrites coming off of it, and then a single axon running down all the way to the skeletal muscle fibers. The synapse between the axon terminal of the alpha motor neuron and the muscle cell is known as the neuromuscular junction. The neurotransmitter released by our alpha motor neuron is acetylcholine. Although a neurotransmitter can be either excitatory or inhibitory, depending upon the receptor that it binds to, at the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is always excitatory. The receptors are always going to create an excitatory response. In order to relax a muscle, we need to prevent an action potential from being generated in the innervating lower motor neuron. That is, we have to inhibit the lower motor neuron, because we are unable to directly inhibit the muscle. The muscle is always excited if neurotransmitter is released. So in order to relax our muscle, we don't inhibit the muscle, we inhibit the lower motor neuron that is going to innervate that muscle. You may have learned in your undergraduate anatomy and physiology how a muscle contracts, with the binding of actin and myosin proteins creating a shortening of the muscle. We're not going to review that entire process, but just a reminder that when acetylcholine is released at the neuromuscular junction and binds to its receptors on the muscle membrane, the end result is to cause a release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm of the muscle cell. And that triggers the entire process leading to muscle contraction. In a healthy system, there is always enough acetylcholine released with every action potential in order to create contraction of the muscle cell. Interestingly, even when at rest, when there are no action potentials happening in the lower motor neuron, the lower motor neuron is releasing very minute amounts of acetylcholine. So just tiny, tiny little amounts of acetylcholine. This presence of this very small amount of acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft produces small local potentials called end plate potentials. These small end plate potentials on the muscle membrane stimulate genes within the muscle to help build protein. So this is how we help maintain the proteins such as actin and myosin and troponin and tropomyosin that are important in the actual structure of the muscle. Additionally, the acetylcholine itself acts as a myotrophic factor. You can think of it simply as kind of a nutritional type of factor. So myo for muscle and trophic is to build or health. So we need these tiny amounts of acetylcholine in order to maintain muscle bulk and muscle health. Because of the dual role of acetylcholine on the muscle, both its myotrophic properties with the minute release at rest and the initiation of muscle contraction when released in larger amounts following action potential propagation down the lower motor neuron. A hallmark of an injury to a lower motor neuron is rapid and pronounced atrophy of the muscle cells. The degree of atrophy and the rapidity with which it presents itself will vary to some extent by the number of lower motor neurons that have been damaged. This atrophy is due to a combination of disuse from the lack of contraction. A muscle cell that is not innervated cannot contract. And the neurogenic component from the loss of the myotrophic properties of acetylcholine and the lack of the health-related properties that provides.